Hey there folks, it's T. Blake Brady here, and in today's video I'm going to be talking about how to fix the Tommyknockers. Okay, so I just finished reading one of Stephen King's most infamous novels. It's controversial for one reason and one reason only. People hate it. It currently has about a 3.5 rating on Goodreads, which you can't judge art based on the Goodreads ratings, but what we can say is that this is a really tough one to finish, and there's a lot of reasons for that. It's a really long book. This is the hardcover from way back in the day, and this isn't, it's really small type. So this book should be a lot thicker, but the main reason that I think the book doesn't work is because that it has a kind of prologue section that lasts way too long. And I think if you got into the meat of the story, like the bones of the story here are good. The Tommyknockers basically centers around a woman who finds an abandoned spaceship in her backyard. This is a great 1950s science fiction plot, okay? It's a great beginning to a novel. And Stephen King doesn't really write science fiction, really. This is probably the closest to like a super alien story he's gotten, but the Tommyknockers just doesn't benefit from having so much in the beginning of the book. So those of you who have read it and need a refresher, there's basically a whole section devoted just to the main character, Bobby Anderson, finding the spaceship, and then it shifts perspective to the other kind of main character, Jim Gardner, going on a poetry tour. And so before these two main characters kind of converge and we start with the actual plot, like what's going to happen, them digging up the spaceship, we have this much that could really be cut out. This is 164 pages that really doesn't really need to be in the book, or it could be placed later into dialogue and just really cut down. And I know that Stephen King doesn't have to listen to my advice, obviously, but I really wanted to like the Tommyknockers so much that I thought that I'd at least offer perspective on how to read it if you haven't read the Tommyknockers, so that you kind of feel like, oh, I get what's going on. I get why this is a book that Stephen King would want to write. Because there's some cool stuff in the beginning with Bobby Anderson finding the spaceship, but it can be cut way down. And the Jim Gardner section, so if you have read the book, Jim Gardner is the poet character, and there's a section of the book where he goes on a poetry tour, gets drunk, and insults a bunch of people, and it basically ruins his career. There's a character named Patricia McCardle who like organizes poetry tours, and he basically ruins everything. And Jim Gardner wakes up and contemplates suicide. He goes so far as like stand on the edge of this cliff thinking about diving off. And I think you could basically pick up there. You could basically pick up the book with Jim Gardner waking up, and you could have flashbacks or something, but to just tell this part of the story that there isn't really a payoff later in the book for this. Because one of the most evocative things that happens in the Tommyknockers is when Jim Gardner actually goes to see his friend Bobby Anderson, because he can't get in touch with her and he just senses something is wrong and he is suicidal. That's a great beginning to a book. And you can build in a lot of the backstory, but having Jim Gardner show up and his friend be completely different is a really interesting and mysterious way to begin a novel. She's gaunt, her dog is gone, and she just doesn't seem like the kind of person. There's also the supernatural element of the fact that she's able to write a book with her mind, like a typewriter. Like she wrote a book over the course of 3 days. And so I think that if you took all of those things out, and move them later, this book becomes instantly more readable. There are a couple of other things. I mean, I think that having a general editor during this book, just a more brave and courageous editor to tell Stephen King no and say, like, we got to shape this up, I think would help. But that's basically it. I think that if you read this book and you kind of dove in here and you're like, oh, I don't quite get it, you could reference earlier stuff. But if you dove right in once part 2 starts, book 2, Tales of Haven, I think you could almost do that. So that's my idea. I also think the ending is way too long, but that's a story for another video. And yeah, the Tommyknockers. I didn't think it was as bad a book as its reputation says. I think a lot of people hate it, but I also think that the reason they hate it is because the beginning is so long. So I still kind of recommend this book. There's a lot to like about it. I think that there's way too much writing. This is a situation where I think Stephen King's editor died while this was being written. Maybe, I don't know. That's a story I heard. But there's a lot of overwriting. If it was pared down, this book would be